everybody, I'm Vasel, and I want to talk a little bit today about dice. Dice in games. I love dice. Dice are used for a lot of things, and I wanted to point out some of the ways that dice are used in games. There's a lot of nuance. Many of the ways I talk about, there's variations and branching and stuff, but I just want to point out some of the way dice are used in games. I love dice, and let's get started. This is the first way dice are used in games. Roll and move is where you roll the dice and move that many spaces. 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, man. And the thing about roll and move is there's all kinds of variations. Hey, if you roll doubles, go again. But it's really super lucky. And it's a good way to move around the board. Some games use spinners. Some games use you draw cards like Candyland. But this is kind of an outdated mechanism, although it is used in some modern games to great effect. Game, Coliseum, you are moving pieces, but these aren't your pieces. You're just trying to get them to go onto these spaces here. So you might get to roll 2 dice, and it says 1 to 3. So maybe I can move this one 3, and then with the other die, move this one 2 to land on different spots. And so you have different ways. Sometimes you can manipulate dice in various roll and move games, where you can play a card with a die, like in Careers. So there are ways to do it that way. Then there are games like this, Formula D, where you're racing cars around the track and you're going to use various dice based on how fast you're going. First gear, I'm going to roll this die, which has numbers on it that are 1 or 2. And this one here, which is just 2, 3, or 4. And when I'm going in full gear, 6 speed, but I also don't want to hit curves too fast. When I'm going like this, you have to stop in a curve. And so you're going to pick the die that you use. There's still the luck of rolling the die, but it's mitigated by you deciding what gear you're going to be in. Rolling and moving is a very basic thing that dice are used for. A more advanced thing, and something that's really fun in games, is picking dice or using dice for actions. And so War of the Ring is a good example of this. In War of the Ring, the dice have different symbols on the different sides, and you're going to roll certain dice. Sometimes you might have more dice depending on what characters you have in play. The game is about Middle-earth, and depending on the symbols that you roll, you'll be able to spend those to take action. Sometimes a symbol gives you something very specific you're going to do, but sometimes a symbol might let you move an army on the board or something like that. And this is a fun way to use dice that adds randomness, but then from those random things that you roll, you get to make some actual decisions in the game. Sometimes this is also a pool of dice available to everyone. So this is kind of a subsection of action selection where it would be action drafting. And that is where, for example, in Seasons, you roll a bunch of dice depending on the number of players, and then whoever's first is going to choose one of these dice. So maybe I'll take this one here, which is just going to give me 6 points. Or this one lets me draw a card. Or this one gives me some resources. And so you're going to pick which one of these you think is best for you, but because of player turn order, as players pick these, your options become more limited. So you're not just drafting dice for actions. Dice drafting is its whole category by itself. Here's a few of the games: Coimbra, Rajas of the Ganges, and Sagrada. Sometimes you just draft dice. You're using the dice as a resource, or the dice will allow you to do something. Coimbra is an interesting game because when you draft dice, the numbers are going to matter because you're trying to use those numbers to buy special cards, but also the colors matter because you'll move up on these tracks on the board based on the dice that you drafted. So it gives you 2 things to think about as you're taking these dice in player turn order. In Sagrada, you're drafting dice also based on colors and numbers, and you're placing them here to build a stained glass window, following rules that you have to have different dice and different numbers in columns and rows, and trying to match various patterns that are shown to you on different cards, like these right here. Then we have dice that actually physically can move, or they act as something. The dice themselves are objects. In the case of Quantum, they're spaceships. In the case of Dice Hospital, they are patients. Here the dice are an actual object, although the numbers on the side still mean something. In Quantum, each spaceship, each number represents a different type of spaceship, and you can do something with it when you activate those dice. And so while they just look like ordinary dice out here, or big, giant, chunky dice, you're going to try to control planets, attack each other, using the numbers on the different sides. In Dice Hospital, patients are showing up at your hospital, and the die itself is a patient, and the number of pips on the die shows how sick they are. And you're going to be using various actions in the game to try to heal your dice to get them to the point where they're level 6 and can be discharged from the hospital. It's a clever way to use dice, the sides of the die, to show both how much health it has, and then the die itself is a physical patient. Very similar to that, we have dice placement. There's a lot of games where you're going to put units on a board to take an action, but there are games where you're placing dice. Kingsburg's a good example of that. You roll 3 dice. So here, for example, I rolled a 3, 5, and a 6. So as this game goes by, I can put a 3 here to take a wood. I can go put a 5 here to get an attack power, and I can do a 6 here to trade some resources. Or I can say I want an 8 to take 2 gold. Or I could put them all together and do a 14 to go up here. And so you have choices based on the dice you roll. There's luck, but you're going to decide which of these people you're going to place the dice on. And in the case of Fantastic Factories, we have you using dice to essentially run machines. So when I roll these dice, I'm going to decide maybe I'll put the 6 there, which lets me do something. Or here I could put 2 dice that are the same, so I might put both 6s there. Or I might want to put 2 6s in the mines where I can place 4 5s and 6s, and then put the 2 here, and whatever you might do. And so this game, you're going to be buying more cards and building more places to put your dice. Dice placement is a really fun, interesting way, and it's used in dozens of different ways throughout games. One of the most common ways that dice are used in games is attacking, from Risk to Access to Allies to Memoir 44 to Summoner Wars. I could make a whole video on different ways that dice are used in combat. Let's just take a look at these two. Many games involve you trying to roll certain numbers on dice, but in Summoner Wars, if you are next to someone, you're simply just trying to roll swords, which are on 5 of the 6 sides. Here, that's 3 hits. If the Mind Witch had rolled the same one, there has 2 arrows, which would be 2 hits. So range can shoot farther away, but will hit less often. And sometimes there's a special symbol here, which something will happen if your character has an ability that lets you use that symbol. These dice are really simple, really easy to use, but lets you do a lot of depth and don't have to calculate numbers. A lot of attacking with dice requires you to subtract dice, add modifiers. Stuff like this is much faster. In Memoir 44, we also have a different kind of combat used, where you'll roll a certain number of dice and you're trying to roll the symbol of what you're hitting. Here, you're trying to hit a tank, we destroyed one. If the tanks are attacking the troops here, they roll 2 tanks. It doesn't hit them, but a grenade hits anybody, so that would kill one of the units. It's a very clean system and allows us to get away from just using numbers on dice to using pictures. This category is pretty simple, made famous by the game you're looking at right now, 25 years old, where we have Catan. And in this game, dice are used consistently to roll and produce resources. And if you happen to have a building that's next to an area that's rolled, so let's say I rolled a 5, then these will produce resources for me. And players are attempting to play off these odds to get the resources to build more buildings. Catan is one of the most famous games in the world, and it uses dice for resource generation. Games like Space Base use this to an even stronger degree, where there's no board and then simply you're rolling dice and using those dice to produce resources. I rolled double 12s. I guess I'm going to get 18 coins now. And you're buying more cards to stick into the different slots. Or I might be able to use 6 twice to activate this card. It's a simple system, but everyone is producing resources when dice are rolled, which is why Catan is so popular, and Space Base is also growing in popularity. Dexterity is maybe one of the sillier versions of dice, and this is where you're actually using the die to do something. In Strike, you are rolling dice and trying to accomplish different numbers, but you can physically hit the other dice trying to knock them out of the way. This is not a huge category, there's not a ton of games in it, but people tend to like these because they're silly, raucous fun. One of the biggest here is shown in this picture of tumbling dice, where you are rolling dice down a platform, and depending on where the die lands, that's how many points you get times the multiplier. So down here it's 4 points, here you can see it's just times 1. And again, it's silly, you're trying to knock other people's dice off, but it adds luck with there being the numbers that you roll. This category is used in quite a few different games in the sense of you're rolling dice to see what happens. Sometimes you're rolling a die to see if a game ends. I've seen some games where you roll a die at the end of turn 6, and then at the end of turn 7, at the end of turn 8, and eventually the game will end. Or Takinoko, a very popular game where you'll roll a die to see what event happens to you that turn. A lot of war games have this, where you'll roll dice and consult a chart to see what happens. They're used to determine some random events that happen in games. Rolling and pushing your luck is there's a various degree that this can be done. The most famous of the games that uses this is Yahtzee, where you're rolling and you can roll up to 3 times trying to get a straight or 4 of a kind. King of Tokyo riffs on that by having you have a giant monster that's fighting other monsters, and you roll dice with symbols on the different sides trying to score points or punching the other monsters that exist. And then there is games like Escape, where you're rolling dice and trying to get high numbers. In Escape, you're trying to move your figure around the board. You do so by rolling dice. When you roll something, you're going to get a 2-digit number. Here I got 76, and here I got 42. You can re-roll as often as you want, but if you ever roll an X, you bust and you're out. The higher the number, the more steps you may be able to go. And then you also push your luck on that, and there's more to this game. It's a really fun, entertaining game, but you're using the die kind of as a probability to push your luck, to gamble a bit. A very simple way that it's used in games is as a counter. This is a 20-sided die. Some players and games will have dice that count down how many hit points you have or how much time you have remaining. Many Magic players use a 20-sided die. In fact, some 20-sided dice, not this one, are specially shaped, and they're not used as a die. They're just used to count down. Now I have 18 hit points left. Now I have 17 hit points. Now 16 hit points. And it's a way just to keep track. It's a really simple thing that dice are used for. And some board games will have dice representing hit points on different people. Instead of counters, this is as if I have 20 different counters, and instead it's all contained in one die. Now, I mentioned Yahtzee earlier as a push your luck game, but it's also the first of what we would call roll and writes. Ra, the dice game, is a similar one, although you're not writing anything, but these are games where you're rolling dice and using those to manipulate things on a board. Or in the case of Dungeon Academy here, you have a dungeon and you will roll some dice and then use it to show how you get through a dungeon. There are many, many games, hundreds of these games, where you'll get a sheet of paper and each person is going to be writing different things down based on the dice that are rolled. In this case, there's symbols making a dungeon. In some games, they're simply numbers. Very popular category, and most of the games are quite small and very portable. This is the last category I have here, and testing is done in many, many games. The most common is with a 20-sided die in role-playing games, where they'll say make a D20 check, and you roll a die, and you need to meet or exceed a certain number for the check to succeed. Arkham Horror and Eldritch Horror do this, where you have to roll 5s and 6s to pass the test. There are lots of games where they'll say you need to do a test. It almost is very similar to combat with dice, but you might be doing something that's not combat oriented at all. And so that's used in a lot of games. These are some very broad categories, and some of the games I mentioned, like Yahtzee, can fit in multiples. There are games that are going to be very specific. I could talk about this subject for a really long time, but this is a broad overview that if you don't like dice, hopefully this gives you an appreciation of them. They're used in so many different ways, and while you might not like one of these categories, I bet there's something here that you would enjoy. What's your favorite way to use dice? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Tom Vasel, and you've been watching me talk about dice on the Dice Tower.